And I'm Madison.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Colin.
We are the Cosínamigos. Olay! 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 Olay!
I am Michael Morales. I will be doing the standard cosine graph. Cosine equals 1 at 0, 2 pi, and pi. Cosine equals 1 or negative 1 at pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. Therefore, when you graph it, you have 1 and negative 1, and then you plot pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. At 0, the graph will be at 1. So this is what the graph would look like. It would go through pi over 2, down negative 1 over 1 pi, go through 3 pi over 2, and go back up to 1. And then if you want to extend it to the negative, you can put negative points. And do the same thing. So it goes through pi over 2, under negative pi, go through negative 3 pi over 2, and then back up. And that is the standard graph of cosine.
In this first example, we're going to be graphing a cosine graph with a phase shift. So the problem is y equals 3 cosine x plus pi over 2. First, we're going to identify the amplitude, which is the absolute value of 3, which is 3. Then we're going to look at the period, which is 2 pi over b, and in this case, b is 1. So the period is 2 pi. And to find the phase shift, you take what's in the parentheses and then equal it to 0. So this phase shift is going to be negative pi over 2. In order to find the remaining intervals, you're going to take your period and multiply it by 1/4 and again by 1/2 and then by 3 over 4. So this is going to equal 2 pi over 4 or pi over 2. This is going to equal 2 pi over 2 or pi, and this is going to equal 6 pi over 4 or 3 pi over 2. You then subtract each one by the phase shift. So this is going to equal 0. This is going to equal pi over 2. And this is going to equal 2 pi over 2, which is equal to pi. Once you find all these intervals, you can start plotting the points on the graph. Because the phase shift was negative pi over 2, this is where our first point is going to be plotted, and our amplitude was 3. Our next interval was 0, then pi over 2, then pi, and then 3 pi over 2. You can then plot additional points in order to make 2 full periods of your cosine graph. The starting point of your cosine graph should be the phase shift. In this case, it was negative pi over 2. You should then have 2 full periods of your cosine graph with a phase shift.
I'm doing example 2, which is a cosine reflection problem, and the first step is to find out what A is. A is equal to negative 2, which is in front of the cosine. And then the amplitude is equal to the absolute value of A, which is equal to the absolute value of negative 2, which would just be 2. Next, we have to find out what B is. And B is the number in front of the x, which is 2. And then to find the period, you use the formula 2 pi over b. So it would be 2 pi over 2, cross out the 2's, so the period would just be equal to pi. Now to find the other points on the graph, you do the period times 1/4, the period, which is pi, times 1/2, and the period times 3/4. The first one would be equal to just pi over 4, and then pi over 2, then 3 pi over 4. And the last point would be just the period, which is just pi. Now we have to graph it. So now we draw in the points that we just found. So we start with pi over 4, pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, and then pi. And then we're going to be doing 2 periods, so I'm going to draw the same ones on the other side, just negative. So negative pi over 4, negative pi over 2, negative 3 pi over 4, and negative pi. And then we have to draw the amplitudes, which is 2 and negative 2. Because this is a reflection problem and the problem starts with a negative 2 and there's a negative in front, we're going to plot our first point at negative 2. And then we go towards the right and we go up to pi over 4, up to 2 over the pi over 2, back down to 3 pi over 4, and then back down to the negative 2 under the pi. And this would be considered one period. Now we're going to do the same on the other side. We're going to go up to negative pi over 4, up to the 2, back down to the negative 3 over 4, and down to negative pi. And do the same thing and draw over those. And this would be the cosine, an example of a cosine reflection for the problem y is equal to negative 2 cosine 2x with 2 periods.
Hello, it's Colin here. We're going to be graphing a cosine function with a vertical shift. You see it's a vertical shift because it's plus 2 on the outside, not inside of parentheses. So we're going to need to know the absolute value. So since there's nothing in front of the cosine, we're going to assume it's 1, the absolute value of 1, which is 1. Now we need to know the period, so since something is in front of x, it's going to be 2 pi over 1, which simplifies to 2 pi. Now we need to plot points. So to plot points, we need to know the 3 points in between 0 and 2 pi. So half of 2 pi is going to be pi, half of pi is going to be pi over 2, and in between pi and 2 pi is 3 pi over 2. So now we need to graph these points. So in a cosine, we start at 0, 1, then we follow through and make somewhat of a parabola in the terms of points. Now, it's not a straight circle going up, it's going to be somewhat of a curve going through because it's functioning as a cosine, not as like an extensive infinite source. So it's going to be like 0 to 1 like that, or like a negative 1 to 1. But since it's a vertical shift, it needs to rise 2, which is what it was before. So we take everything we had and raise it by 2 on the y value. So on your first point, it's going to be 3 instead of 1. Your next point, it's going to be 2 instead of 0. And then 1 instead of negative 1. 2 instead of 0. And 3 instead of 1. So we're going to follow that through, connect the points, and slowly. And yeah, that's what it should look like. Thank you everyone. Have a great day.